If your company is remote or hybrid, then you know just how difficult it can be to grow your company's culture beyond a pre-scheduled Zoom happy hour or occasional lunch and learn. Well, this week's sponsor is here to solve that. They're called CultureBot. CultureBot has devised what will likely become the gold standard for growing and blossoming a company culture inside of Slack. The app is like a sidekick for any HR or people professional, automating a lot of the mundane tasks you probably are forgetting to do on a daily basis. Things like birthday and work anniversary celebrations, team shoutouts and kudos, employee introductions, and remote games. It even has health and wellness tips and conversation starters. If that piques your interest, this will get you even more excited. Today, I'm able to share a special promotion for listeners of the podcast. You can get your first 6 months of CultureBot for 50% off. Plus, if your team is under 25 employees, CultureBot is free forever. So if you're looking for a way to create a culture of appreciation and drive increased engagement and togetherness across your team, I definitely recommend checking out CultureBot. Go to getculturebot.com/humanhr. That's getculturebot.com/humanhr to get the offer. Plus, I've added the link in the show notes so you can just click right there. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Welcome to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. I'm Tracy Chernoff, and I've spent my entire professional career in HR. Each week, we'll explore the delicate balance between people and business with the aim to reconnect the two and create meaningful outcomes. Listen in as I share my own experiences, challenge the status quo, and chat with guests from various industries about our mission to bring the human back to human resources. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so glad that you are here and that you've decided to join me for another week. And this is another week with another amazing guest. And so I'm just going to jump right in. You already know to rate, review, and subscribe. I feel like I don't have to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. So rate, review, and subscribe. Don't forget to do it. Let me tell you a little bit about our guest this week. Katie McLaughlin is the founder, chief strategist, and transformation artist at McLaughlin Method. She helps organizations create engaged employees and a positive, inclusive workplace culture. And I feel like we can all get behind that. She uses techniques from improvisational theater to rehearse common scenarios in the work environment and adopt behaviors that support organizational cultural goals. Katie has over 20 years of experience facilitating, teaching, and coaching. And before starting McLaughlin Method, Katie earned 2 Horizon Awards for her trainings, supported software implementations with robust change management programs, and developed countless onboarding programs for sales, customer service, and other customer-facing roles. Katie is passionate about people, dancing, and travel, and she believes we can build a better world one interaction at a time. I love that. Katie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Oh my gosh, so glad to have you. I think all of the listeners are probably going to love that last line because as I was reading it, I was like, yeah, I love this. We can build a better world one interaction at a time. And let's start with this interaction then. I already told you when we started recording that I really wanted to jump into DE&I, but I didn't tell you why. So the reason
Mm.
why I want to start out by talking about DE&I and how we can drive inclusivity in the workplace is because actually I feel like it has fallen off the radar for most companies. During 2020, 2021, that was like the most used phrase, I think it was, or something like that on social media during that time for obvious reasons. But in recent months and recent years, I'll say, I feel like DE&I has kind of fallen off the radar. So as I share that, do you like agree, disagree? What are your thoughts?
I completely agree. I think it's moved from the forefront kind of into the back of our minds. And whenever that happens, what what you measure is managed, and what you think about you take action on, right? Your awareness. We talk a lot in my work with my clients about how your awareness, when you bring that to different things, you can't unsee something anymore. And so it's going to niggle at
Yeah.
you and you're going to have to do something about it. It's a lot harder to take action on something that has moved to the back of your mind. And I don't mean that it's become, unconscious, that like you're just doing it naturally. I mean, you're not really thinking about it, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's funny because actually, as you were saying that, I had this instinct to think, Well, gosh, if it's muscle memory and we just do it instinctively, that might be okay. But it was in that moment that I was thinking that you were like, let's not be unconscious about it because then we're not actively thinking about it. And I think that's I'm so glad that you said that as exactly as I was thinking the opposite, because it's true. Even if we have muscle memory for the things that we have to prioritize and care about, it's not the same as actively working out. It's not the same as actively thinking about or thinking through the things that you need to solve for or make an impact on or have an impact on.
Yeah, it's one thing I equate like an analogy that I use is goes back to cleaning. It's something that like I think we can all relate to. And when you're like, all right, I'm gonna clean the kitchen. You get out your normal kind of everyday kitchen cleaning stuff because I'm assuming this is not like one of those crazy spring cleaning like hyper clean activities. This is like, okay, I got to clean the counters, I got to finish my dishes, right? And then you go and you move your coffee pot, and under the coffee pot, there is this like sludge of coffee that you don't know how long it's been there, right?
Yes.
And now you can't unsee it. Like you're not going to be able to put the coffee pot back right. It's going to niggle in your mind. And so you're going to have to get out new tools, right? You're going to have to get out different kinds of cleaning materials, spend a little more time, but that investment is always really worth it because now it's no longer weighing on you and it's no longer
Hmm.
occupying conscious thought. And maybe even, I know for me sometimes that turns into like, all right, Katie, you should what you should do, you should go do that thing, right? So
Hmm.
that's something that I just often encourage us to think about is, have we first of all taken the time to like move the coffee pot, like change our perspective a little bit? And what are we doing about that new gunk that has been revealed? Are we doing anything about it?
Yeah, I like that analogy. I like that perspective. It's like once you realize that you can't ignore something, you pay extra attention to it. But it's almost like, how do you prevent the sludge from forming, right? Like you have to
Mhm.
clean the coffee pot every day, to your point. And when we think about DE&I, it's like if you're not paying attention to the things that drive inclusivity and diversity and equity every single day, then at some point you're going to have a coffee pot to clean
Right,
at the bottom
totally,
of it.
and I'm glad you made that connection because I was thinking about that just then, that, you know, I believe also that we're impacted by those external, stimuli. In 2020, 2021, companies were facing the reality of, the Black Lives Matter movement really being at the forefront in the media and everyone's minds, and,
Hmm.
in 2021, the theme was the Great Resignation, and so like those things were keeping these topics at the forefront, and now it's 2022, and we did maybe our checkbox activities of DEI, which is what I think most companies focused on. Have we made
Hmm.
a anti-racism statement on our website? Have we created some new policies or new procedures within hiring or within our organization to prevent discrimination, to increase diversity? And we never usually
Hmm.
move past that into what you said around like those daily interactions that lead to diversity of ideas, right? Diversity of perspectives, equality in opportunity, equality in, the ability to kind of speak up and share ideas. And then I focus with my clients almost exclusively sometimes on inclusion because that's where every single day we make a difference towards equality and towards
Yes.
diversity. So, yeah, I hope that this year becomes the year of inclusion. But, I'm not sure how we get that societal pressure on
Hmm.
inclusion in the kind of same way as we've had, in the past couple of years on DEI in general.
Yeah, it's a good point. I don't know either. Sometimes I think that inclusivity is I guess applied pressure or applies pressure. Societal pressure comes from like the continuation and consistency. So when I think about inclusivity and societal pressure, I think the more we talk about it, the more we focus on it, then the more normal it is, the more of an expectation it becomes. And this, we see this with social justice movements all the time. The more energy, the more airtime, the more conversations we have about it, the less, the less we kind of shy away from having difficult conversations, the more we just focus on what, the matter at hand is, the more clearly we will be able to look at the situation. Now, I think about inclusivity like on a micro and macro scale. And I actually was just talking to someone today, actually, about this, that who had kind of shared that they were feeling like their company culture was really not what the organization said that it really was trying to be, or who they were being, or who they are. And, I said to this person, well, if you look at culture on a micro scale and inclusivity on a micro scale, and you impact your own team, and your team impacts their friends within the team, and their friends impact, and we have all of these like micro examples of inclusivity being driven, even if it's between 1 to 5 people, then at some point there's going to be a macro effect. There's going to be this,
Mhm.
oh, when we zoom out, the organization is prioritizing the thing that all of these smaller groups and micro elements of driving this focus, like where that all kind of comes into play for, to try and sum that up as quickly as possible. But and as I was sharing this with this person, I was thinking, well, this is exactly what people mean when they say that culture is driven by everyone. But when we think about it with
Mhm.
inclusivity, how do you do that? It only takes one person to exclude someone to say that inclusivity doesn't matter. So it's in the same vein, it takes one person to demonstrate inclusivity to show that that's like their priority. And then I think the same thing, the micro turns into the macro. But I'm sure a lot of people are looking for the macro to impact the micro first.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a tension there around we really kind of need both, right? The
Yeah.
I talk with my clients and a lot of my work on those micro interactions, because at the end of the day, that is the thing that most of us have the highest control over, right?
Right.
Are those micro interactions? How am I showing up in my one-on-ones? How am I showing up in a team meeting? Am I excluding someone's idea? Am I kind of scanning the room to see who's not contributing, and can I help amplify their voice? Those little moments help to create a more inclusive team, a more inclusive kind of relationship with people at work. And then you get that, spillover effect, right? Which speaks back to that line in my bio around like what we can build a better world one interaction at a time. And, that's exactly why, right? Each of those little interactions helps to boost others and make them a little bit happier. And then they're going
Mhm.
to have a little more energy maybe to go into that next conversation. Um, but that tension
Yeah.
that I was mentioning really be, we need that like from the bottom up, perspective on micro up to macro, but we still really need that macro down to micro. And I'm very intentionally saying up versus down because
Mhm.
of the power dynamics that are embedded in in all of our culture, but especially at work with reporting structures. And
Yeah.
you know in some ways it's not enough for just you know the everyday employee to be making that change. It has to be modeled from the top down, because what we what is modeled is we consider, well, that's a measurement of success. Why would somebody be in these higher levels in their career in our company if these weren't the qualities that
Mhm.
makes a strong leader, right? And that's one of those things that is
Right.
like subliminally happening for all of us, that we don't really recognize the importance of how our executives, our directors, our managers are interacting. They're saying this is what it means to be successful in business, in your career.
Wow. That is so real and so impactful. Like when we think, I mean, we really have to digest that. that I mean, it's truly like every promotion, every email, every meeting, every stream of communication really demonstrates and shows where the value lies. And this has been a huge topic of conversation when it comes to gender bias too, because and
Mm,
I think as you were before I jump into that, as you were talking about the importance of the macro to micro just as much as the micro to macro. I realize we're using a lot of these terms. I'm going to break it down, but I was thinking about how from the top down perspective, there is space that needs to be created. If the head of an organization or the leadership team within an organization doesn't make space for the things that, people who are working at maybe a smaller scale on an organization, or at like what I try to say, like the more detailed level, those who are maybe
mm,
individual contributors or not managers, or, new to the company, they they are not going to be the ones necessarily to create that space. They're going to be the ones to say, hey, we need this space, if they feel that there's psychological safety to be able to do so and to say that. And then, on the flip side, coming back to this point on gender bias, this conversation happens a lot, that if you don't have women or people of color, we can go beyond gender bias. We can kind of touch every avenue here. If you don't have those groups represented on your leadership team, then you can speak until you're blue in the face that this matters to you, but it doesn't actually matter unless you're actually, again, making that space. And it's not to say that people should go out and only look at candidates from one
mm.
background or another, but how are you creating equity and that opportunity for people from different backgrounds and demographics to be able to be in those roles?
Yeah, you know, as you were kind of describing that, my mind went to like a place of empathy and compassion for people in HR around hiring.
Hmm.
And it's not just around hiring, right? It's like, okay, so maybe we're a company who we look around at our executive team and we acknowledge that, we are very white, we are very male heavy. And so it's like, cool, what do we do about that? Right? Like, we're not necessarily going to just let people go, right? Like, or necessarily just
Right.
replace them. Um, but I think what's important is that while we're trying to kind of reach those milestones, I would say, for diversity and equity kind of in appearance, we have to be making those changes under the surface, right? So are we considering diverse ideas even among the current populace? So, if we all have, if we're a very white executive team, not very female, not very male female balanced, are we like kind of becoming prey to just group think and not
Mm.
actually appreciating the diverse ideas that are going to come from every individual, right? We all have individual experiences that bring a richness and a value to our company culture, to our company strategy, to the way that we care for our customers. And that is really the core of why diversity is desired, right?
Hmm.
So that way we can have that perspective so we can, really thrive and flourish as a company.
Right. Right. There was a message that I received recently about this an organization that a listener works for, and there was I guess maybe a survey sent out, or if I'm remembering correctly, there was some sort of like feedback solicited, and it was trying to understand where, if there's enough psychological safety, not that there's ever enough, but if there's psychological safety, if that is a value that's felt, and if there is an appreciation and a commitment to hearing other
Mhm.
opinions and other voices and thoughts and things like that. And that really, I guess this person was saying that this is not something that is demonstrated, and that there is this kind
Mm.
of like groupthink mentality, which sometimes does happen without people realizing, just because there isn't enough diversity whatever that means to you. It could be diversity in anything from gender to race to anything, but that there isn't, because it's so easy if you're not focused on that for that to happen, that then the groupthink just naturally occurs. And so this person had reached out saying, well, how can this person is an HR person, so they have some influence over this. How can I work with my organization and my peers, my leaders, to encourage more conversation and to let other people whose voices are not necessarily heard to be heard? And then, of course, following up with
Mm.
that, how do we actually drive psychological safety? How do we create it when there are individuals who are so used to being the ones that are the loudest in the room, always heard, and always agreeing with one another? And I think it's a great question. So I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
I remember when I first heard the term psychological safety and kind of dug into, the writings about it. And I was like, yes, this is kind of like what I've been thinking about, what I've been talking about for most of my career, even before starting my own business. And one of the real challenges with HR and talent professionals is that we get what the buzz phrases are and the language is around people interactions, but we're not always great at
Mhm.
translating what that means, and not just what it means, what it looks like in practice. What does that feel like day to day? And so I'm really glad that this conversation that you were having was about, what can I do, right? And I want to unpack psychological safety for a moment. On that, psychological safety is about that, do I feel like it is safe to make contributions in the workplace, regardless of whether there's going and that there won't be retribution if I report an error, or if I'm a whistleblower, or if I just bring up a contrary outside perspective. And that notion of safety is so important, but very challenging for people who feel safe in the workplace. Often those outspoken, people who get their voice heard don't
Mhm.
understand, right? Because for them it's safe. And so they don't maybe understand why it's not safe for other people. And so the important thing is, from my perspective, is to recognize that when things aren't safe, it's because the stakes are too high. It will feel
Mm.
like to those people that they're sticking their neck out, and that there will be problems for them, whether that's
Mm.
they will have someone kind of lash out at them, they might be looked over for an opportunity, they might not be asked again, for their opinion, or even more hurtful potentially, but that they could be shot down in the moment. And all of those kinds of things could threaten their standing in the workplace, could threaten their livelihood. We all work so we can eat, right? Like, at the
Mhm.
end of the day,
Right.
unless we're, independently wealthy, which is probably not most of us who are,
Right.
in the
Yeah.
workplace, you know, our jobs and our livelihood at work are so, um, they're high stakes, And so we have to remember that that's what we're talking about.
It's important for any business to focus on their culture, employee well-being, and strategic growth. But without the proper tools, it can be next to impossible to support the people behind your success. That's why you need Namely, the all-in-one HR solution that empowers you to engage and develop your people in one intuitive platform. Namely's award-winning technology covers your essential HR, payroll, and compliance needs all in one place. Whether you have 50 or 1,000 employees, Namely's modern and integrated platform is designed to be used by everyone, every day. With a mobile app and elegant UI, Namely empowers employees with self-service tools to request PTO, acknowledge peers, review pay stubs, and enroll in benefits. Namely helps you easily handle everything from onboarding, payroll, time tracking, open enrollment, employee engagement, and so much more, so that you can get the time and data you need to drive the initiatives your company really cares about. I want you to simplify your HR processes with Namely, so I've arranged a special offer for my listeners. Right now, get a free month of unlimited access to Namely's all-in-one HR platform, but only when you go to namely.com/humanhr. Remember, go to namely.com/humanhr for your free month today. Oh, that is a great point. I am excited to share this episode with the person who had messaged me once this is out, because I think this is really going to add a layer of understanding for them. I mean, everything that you said is 100% true. And I think about my own experiences with working in environments with really, I'm going to say hazardous cultures, because I don't know that everything is always
Mm,
toxic when it's like this, but it can be hazardous because it could certainly become toxic. There is a
mhm,
fine line between aggressive cultures, or like cultures that maybe are in some way placing value on the person who is the loudest, the proudest, and uh, you know, kind of shooting down ideas because they have a better one. There's that, and then there's like toxic work environments, and I do think again there's a fine line. But when I think about my own experience in, like I said, hazardous work environments, I I there is a difference in even just how each individual interacts in that environment. I have been the person who's been fairly resilient, and I'm like, all right, you want to go toe to
mm.
toe? Let's go. We're going to go toe to toe. You
Yeah.
want to fight me? I'm going to fight you. And that is not the norm for most people. Most people are not going to match, an aggressive personality. And I'm not talking about physical, I'm talking all proverbial, let's have, heated debates type of, let's fight, let's fight. But and this is that's if you're fighting physically, that's a toxic work environment. Don't do that, don't get fired. But
Yeah.
I digress. But I would say that most people in an environment that is hazardous or aggressive, they are not going toe to toe. They're most often backing away and saying, this is not an environment for me. I'm unhappy. I can't my voice is not heard. They don't care about me, and it snowballs into, they don't like me. I'm going to get fired if I say anything. When the one time I did say something, they shot me down, and that's not necessarily personal, but it's because this environment has predicated this like hazardous aggressive type of, environment. And so I
Mm.
guess thinking through that, I'm sure that many listeners are thinking about their own experiences here. What would you say to someone, or share as a piece of advice, I guess, if they don't want to go toe to toe, but they also really don't want to look for another job? But how do they affect and insert themselves in change that won't make them feel like they're sacrificing their livelihood in order to do so?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I just want to e- really empathize with any listeners who are going through
Yeah.
that. And I also want to acknowledge that you're not alone, right? That there are a lot of people who feel
Right.
that way. And I will say, I really identify with your self description, Tracy, of being that kind of resilient person willing to go toe to toe. But I know I've also had times where I feel completely shut down, and I'm like,
Yeah.
all right, well, that's the end of that argument for
Mm-hmm.
me, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And sometimes that's been in a meeting, and other times that's been one on one with a leader.
Right.
And my recommendation to anyone who wants to start having their voice heard, but isn't sure if it's safe, first of all, is to do some reflection. There's a lot of models out there that talk about the relationship between reflection and action, and our culture today is so focused on action. Now, I have a huge bias for action, so I love action. However, doing the wrong action or for the wrong reasons or with the wrong motivation isn't going to necessarily get the results you want. And
Mm.
so, if we take that time to reflect, and if you're that person who doesn't feel like you can speak up, why? Are there particular individuals? What do you feel is at stake for you? And, what kinds of things would make you feel safer? So, some ideas of kind of action that might come out of that um, reflection is, maybe in order to feel safe, you need to have an ally, an amplifier in the room. So
Mm.
I'm assuming that in most of these instances, it's going to be when there's a group, because I've seen more of that, that feeling of it not being safe when it's in a group.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, seek out someone on your team who is an ally and explain to them what I would encourage you to be vulnerable and let them know what's going on for you, and share your idea individually and say, hey, even if you don't agree with this, I could use your help, you know, amplifying my voice so that way it gets heard. And so I'm not only met with resistance in the room. Would you be willing to, potentially help me and kind of be on the lookout for that in this upcoming, meeting?
That's a
Um,
great point.
yeah. So I think that's one option. I highly recommend people start having, you know, uncomfortable conversations, and do what you can to make it as safe for you as possible. So that might include not having that conversation when you're feeling really emotionally triggered about that experience, and waiting for a time for when that will be safest, for you emotionally, so that way you feel like you can be upfront. Maybe you need to write down your thoughts, maybe you need to run them through your manager first, or what have you, right? There's lots of options. And honestly, when in doubt, we don't do enough to practice, in our day to day, these difficult conversations, and that's really
Yeah.
what I'm all about in my work with my clients, and in my past career working inside companies, is that we need that opportunity for a rehearsal for reality. Why are we always
Mm-hmm.
using a very real, potentially high stakes scenario as our way where we do a skill that we haven't mastered yet or haven't even tried? So
That's a
practice,
great
practice,
point.
practice.
Yes, I love that. In one of my very first episodes of this podcast, I remember talking about how I had a mentor who is a friend of mine, but she was a mentor first. And then we became friends and we had worked together back in the day, when I was still at Target. And she, it was a really tough transition. I had just graduated college. I became this like HR manager in store. And I'm like, what the heck is happening here? Like I'm trying to figure this all out and managing all these people, and it was a lot. And there was someone who really gave me a run for my money. And there was a moment where I was like, I don't know if I can do this. Maybe I can't do this. And she was like, you just have to have the conversations. You can't like throw in the towel without trying to salvage this. And also, don't let anyone else like determine whether you're happy at work. Like, you have to be happy at work for yourself. And then she was like, all right, let's like role play. Let's practice this. How are you going to address these poor behaviors? And it was like one of the most important practices or actions that I had ever done in my entire career, because I've had a long career since then. But, the practicing piece, the role playing, is one of those things that I share with every single person when they ask for advice, because it's really true what you've said, that, you run the potential, you run the risk of doing this for the first time in a high stakes moment where your emotions could be running high. But if you kind of let it out a little bit and you practice with someone who's going to give you raw, honest feedback, like a mentor, like a friend, or a feedback partner, as I often call them, then you're going to get out some of those nerves or the things that could make you feel like coming out of that conversation like it didn't go great. So I think it's a really, really astute point that the practicing is one of the most crucial things that we can do. And also like practicing for anything, even if you're new to managing and you have to figure out how you're going to deliver like an annual review or
Right.
any, or like a corrective action or anything, or talk to someone about their feedback. Like practicing is always a good idea.
Yeah. And that, honestly, that's a big reason why, one of many reasons why I use theater in my work with
Mm.
clients, because it gives us, some structure with which to practice. And, that emotional piece of our interactions with others really doesn't get enough attention, and that's another piece I
Mm,
focus on, because we have to start to understand, okay, what are some of those emotions that I'm experiencing that are going to impact my performance, right? Our emotions are going to trigger actions. We're going to act from those emotions. So if we think about some kind of traditional, mental health, cognitive behavioral therapy,
mhm,
um, places, the flow is there's a kind of input that triggers thoughts, those thoughts trigger emotions, and those emotions trigger actions, and our actions get results whether we like them or not. So I really have us start to focus on that emotion piece, because as we start to understand how do I act from these like flared up emotions, the better it will be and the easier it will be for us um, to act from a place that we choose from, and we can choose better after we've practiced. You know,
right, right,
Uh,
absolutely.
I want to actually come back to something that you said,
Yeah.
though, that advice from that other person. I don't know if I agree with what she said about,
Mm.
don't let anyone else impact your happiness at work. And I'm curious how you took that and how you think about that now.
Ooh, this is interesting. I think in the moment it was exactly what I needed to hear because the
Mm,
person that was really like that I allowed to get to me, let's say, because no one,
mhm,
no one does anything to you like it. Well, actually, let me take that back. That's not necessarily true for me in this situation. I was kind of like in my head and I wasn't controlling the things that I could control and I was just focused on what
mm,
she was doing. And so in this case, it was, even though I wasn't the one with the bad behavior, I also wasn't helping myself. So I was like,
mm.
because this was my first really like experience after college, I was kind of just so over it. I was ready to throw in the towel. And so I think in that context, it was exactly what I needed to hear. However, I hear what you're saying. I think, if I were to give myself, or if I were to say that to myself now, I think I would say, like, well, the people who I love working with really affect my happiness at work. And I love that they drive my happiness up because I love working with them. But I don't know. I guess if I were to think critically about that advice, I would think, well, it's better to focus on what you can do rather than what someone else is doing because you can only control your action and reaction. So if someone
Mhm.
is making you feel some kind of way, what do you have control over to affect a different feeling? Like when I think about what we were just talking about like going toe to toe with someone who is, while in an aggressive or a hazardous work environment, and I think about a time where I talked about this last year in my podcast. I quit a job after not even 90 days. I wasn't in role for even
Mm,
90 days because it was not the right place for me. And reading between the lines, it definitely had something to do with culture. And
mm,
there was a part of me when I reflect on that I did not help myself in a few ways, but one of the ways
mm,
was that I didn't actively work to change my mindset. I'm not disappointed that I didn't because it wasn't the right environment for me. So I could have tried as hard as possible and it probably still would not have resulted in the outcome that I'd want. But yeah, I think if I think critically about it, I can see why maybe it's sound advice for that situation, but not
mhm.
necessarily sound advice for every situation.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think giving it more thought myself, I would actually say that it's kind of like any advice and everything in moderation, right?
Yes.
Because we can get stuck in these mindsets of, when we've experienced some of that like toxicity or hazards or aggressions or, you know, not
Yeah.
safe scenarios, we we can get stuck there, right? And it can feel like a victim kind of mentality,
Yeah.
and rightfully so. Like after so many hurts, it can be really hard to pull yourself out of it, and it's usually through the help of somebody else that we are able to pull ourselves out of that and change our perspective. And many times
Mm.
we just need a challenge, right? Like that,
Yeah.
hey, don't let somebody else affect your happiness at work. And, we need that empowerment. But then,
Yeah.
a lot of other
Yeah.
times, people who don't understand the hurt that other people are going through, um, I think latch on to the notion of that it's other people's responsibility to uh, make sure that they are happy at
Mm.
work, right? Rather than understanding that we all have, I believe, a responsibility to each other, especially when we are in relationship with
Yes.
each other, which work is a series of relationships, right? We have a
Yeah.
responsibility to the people around us, and how we treat them and how we present ourselves and react, and, what we do with our emotional stuff.
Yeah. This is a really, really good point. I'm so glad that you asked this question and that you brought it up, because it's true. It kind of does misplace the accountability in some ways. Like, if someone is making your experience hell, then have maybe it's worth having that conversation, like, hey, like, I'm committed to your happiness, I'm committed to you having a great
Mm,
experience. Why is this not reciprocated? What is happening? How can we move past this? How can we get through this together? And actually, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about today was like personal conflicts, and I think this is actually a perfect
mm,
way to kind of have this conversation, that those conversations are probably not happening 10 times because it's hard to have conversations like that. Difficult conversations in general can be scary. And so when you think about like taking this example, that advice that does kind of put accountability on the recipient of bad behavior, potentially, depending on how you look at it, like, can these interpersonal conflicts be resolved? Is a conversation the way to go through with that? Like, what have you seen as far as, success stories and maybe even failures that have resulted from these types of conflicts?
yeah. When I think about personal conflict and whether or not to have a conversation, I am always the advocate for having a conversation,
Yeah.
and 1000% acknowledge that that is not easy. And that's why I really emphasize, going back to our psychological safety conversation earlier, that like, how do we make it safe for ourselves, right? And one of the reasons I'm going to kind of now illustrate, since we have the luxury of video here, I'm going to illustrate the how I use theater to help unpack some of these types of conversations so we can make more conscious choices in how we show up, because that's where we get into trouble with kind of personal conflict, or starting some of these vulnerable
Hmm.
conversations, is that we get put on the defensive or the offensive, when we
Right.
feel threatened or triggered, and that's like our habitual response. We almost have no control over how that habitual innate interaction or reaction happens. We do have a control over whether or not we take a breath, and whether or not we act from that place of innate, challenged reaction, or if we make a choice. And so, if I want to speak right now to the people who are going to start one of those potentially unsafe, vulnerable conversations that would result in personal conflict, kind of like what you described earlier of, hey, I'm invested in your happiness and I'm not seeing that reciprocated, right? Like, that sounds so simple
Hmm.
for either of us to say,
Hmm.
uh, right? So, I would encourage people to, I use images. I use your body, your facial expression to create images, uh, of how we're actually feeling about something. And if we think, take that out to our, common phrase of a picture is worth 1,000 words, that's why I have people do this, because your image can convey a lot more than how you might initially add kind of vocabulary to something. So, someone who's thinking about, okay, I need to go have this conversation about someone's not invested in my happiness based on their actions. How do you feel about that? And if you create a larger than life image of that, someone might kind of like want to cringe, and they're kind of protecting themselves a little bit. You can see in my shoulders, like they're all hunched and tense, and
Hmm.
you know, making a scowly face, right? And if I think about, now, granted, I'm probably not going to actually like walk into a conversation in this position. But if
Right.
I pretend for a moment that I am, right? because that's essentially what's happening in your brain and happening emotionally, right? If I walk into the conversation like this, right, then I'm going to probably say something I'm going to regret. I might kind of lash out a little bit, or maybe I'll even like speak in, really quiet, like, oh, I don't want to, quiet or like kind of qualitative in a not a great way of like, oh, I mean, I'm tentative and I don't know what I want to do, right? Like, so that's not the place you want to act from. So then I have people create an image of how you'd like to enter that conversation, right? And so again, larger than life, maybe you roll your shoulders back, like your eyes are bright, and maybe you have like a sense of strength, kind of with your hands or fists like up in front of you, but not from a place of I'm going to fight you, but more of a strength and a I feel solid, right?
Mm,
That if I go into a conversation like that, I feel empowered. I feel like I have the right to, speak up. And there's also a sense of openness and a willingness to hear what the other person has to say. Um, and so
right.
just by creating those images, feeling what they feel like, and extrapolating what actions, how would I act from this place, helps us to start to make that choice. Okay, I know that I might feel this way going into it. So maybe I'll go then create this pose. There's so much out there around kind of power poses, whereas you kind of, with my
Yes.
work, you make your own power pose. And so if you do that a little bit before you go into that conversation, before you press join on your virtual meeting, uh,
Right.
you you're going to start to actually affect your emotional landscape, your psyche, and be that much more able to act from that place as opposed to the earlier image.
I love that. I think that's like such an awesome, I don't know, approach, I guess. And that I'm sure that everyone has heard about a power pose, but the idea of like actually creating the energy that you want the conversation to have before going into the conversation, I just love that. I'm going to have to do that. I'm taking that.
And honestly, it's something
Applying
I
it, I should
practice
say.
myself. Like there are
Mm,
times when, I'm like, oh, I've got to go into this client meeting, or um, maybe I need to go into prospect conversation or whatever it is. And I'm just not feeling it, because
mhm.
we all have that, right? And I go through that cycle. I ask, okay, what am I genuinely, honestly feeling? Can I make that larger than life? Maybe you need to make multiple images because it's complex, right? And really
Mhm.
honor where you're at. And then, okay, ask yourself, where do I want to be? How do I want to show up? And then create that pose and keep like cycling through the images to make sure that you get one that really like hits home and resonates, like, yes, that's how I want to show up, that's how I want the other person to perceive me, and what feels good for me. So yeah, I practice what I preach on this one.
I love it. I love it. I feel like actually this is the perfect place for us to close out because that is like absolutely an impressionable and lasting thought that I want everyone to walk away with, including myself. That it's kind of like a mind over matter. What we do for ourselves can be what we create for others, and what we create
Mm.
for everyone involved, including ourselves. And I really appreciate your approach to not only conflicts but also environments and culture, and how we can use all of these tools and skills that we've learned from this short conversation that we've had today and apply those things later on. Now, of course, I'm sure that there are listeners that are going to want to learn more, not only about what you do, but how you think and where else they can connect with you. So I would love if you shared with the listeners where they can reach out.
Absolutely. I have definitely loved this conversation and would be glad to share more with folks. I share on LinkedIn. You can follow me, Katie McLaughlin, and feel free to connect. I'd love to know that uh, had you listened to this conversation and that's why you're reaching out to connect. And then also visit my website, McLaughlinMethod.com. I have a blog as well as where any of these podcasts or kind of different free speaking engagements that I do are all posted there, because I know the power of being able to kind of continue to dig back into and hear things we might have heard before, but in a different way. So yeah, and I'd love to speak with anyone who wants to, connect more.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Katie. And for everyone out there, I will, of course, have everything in the show notes, so you can just head there, head to the links, or head to my website for those links as well. Katie, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been amazing.
Thank you.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.